The reconnaissance probe returned data that made no sense. Supreme Admiral Voreth Kelm stood at the center of the Dominion's tactical sphere, aboard the unyielding throne, his flagship and the crown jewel of the Ninth Armada, and watched the probe's telemetry unspool across 7 holographic layers. The probe had been dispatched 31 hours ago into the Cinder Approach, a corridor of dead space between the Rithani Shoals and the outer boundary of what the Dominion's navigational archives labeled Quarantine Shell 7. Nothing lived in Quarantine Shell 7. Nothing had lived there for 1100 years. The archives were explicit on this point. The species cataloged under Index 7714, the ones who called themselves humans, had been assessed, stamped with a threat rating of 0.4, and filed under the non-emergent fauna subsection 9 centuries before Voreth had drawn his first breath. The probe disagreed. "Display the mass reading again," Voreth said. His voice was quiet. He was not a commander who raised his voice. He had commanded the Ninth Armada for 42 years, and in those 4 decades, he had pacified 19 systems, overseen 6 fleet engagements, and never once lost a capital vessel. He spoke quietly because he had earned the right to be heard without shouting. Tactical Officer Yeneth expanded the mass reading to primary display. The number hung in the tactical sphere like an accusation. 312 million metric tons. Voreth's secondary hands, the smaller pair that Valori used for precision work and emotional emphasis, folded behind his back. His primary hands remained clasped before him. "And this is a single contact." "A single contact, Supreme Admiral." The probe classified it as one vessel. Yeneth's throat slits were cycling faster than normal, which meant she was managing her own confusion. "The mass profile doesn't match anything in our engagement library. There is no silhouette comparison within tolerances." "No silhouette comparison," Voreth repeated. He let the words settle in the sphere. Around him, the Ninth Armada occupied a formation sphere 200,000 kilometers across. 4,200 warships. 3 dreadnought-class command vessels including his own. 1,600 strike cruisers. 800 torpedo frigates. The rest were escorts, interceptors, and logistics hulls. It was the largest single armada the Dominion had deployed in living memory, assembled for Operation Threshold, a pacification sweep of 3 systems along the Cinder Approach that Dominion intelligence had flagged as potential staging grounds for the Rithani insurgency. The insurgency was why they were here. The single impossible contact was not. "Origin classification?" Voreth asked. The probe attempted 37 cross-references against the engagement library. Yeneth hesitated. Her throat slits stopped cycling entirely, which was worse than fast cycling. 36 returned null. The 37th returned a partial match to an archived entry under Index 7714. The match confidence is 11%. Index 7714 is the human catalog number. "Yes, Supreme Admiral." "The species with a threat rating of 0.4. "Yes, Supreme Admiral." Voreth studied the holographic layers. The contact was holding position near a debris belt approximately 9 hours from the Ninth Armada's current coordinates at standard approach speed. It was not moving. It was not broadcasting. It was simply there, 312 million metric tons of something that had no right to exist in a quarantine shell that the Dominion had written off 9 centuries ago. "Expand the probe's visual capture," he said. The image was grainy. The probe had maintained a cautious distance of 40,000 kilometers, standard protocol for unknown contacts, and the resolution suffered at that range. But even through the grain, the shape was legible. It was not elegant. That was the first thing Voreth noticed. Every warship in the Dominion's fleet was designed with the Valori aesthetic in mind. Flowing hull lines, harmonic proportions, surfaces that caught light in calculated ways. This thing was none of that. It was angular, blunt. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched plating, some sections polished dark, others scarred and discolored, as though they had been welded on from different sources at different times. The forward section was a wedge that tapered to a flat face, bristling with what the probe's limited analysis flagged as possible weapons emplacements, though it could not confirm the number because the thermal interference from the hull itself was scrambling its sensors. The hull was radiating heat, not from engines, from the hull itself, as if the entire vessel were running so many internal systems simultaneously that the excess thermal output was bleeding through the armor. "How old is that hull?" Voreth asked. Yenneith worked her console. Based on the oxidation patterns on the exterior plating and the carbon scoring, the probe estimates the oldest sections of the hull are between 700 and 900 years old. Voreth's primary hands unlocked from their clasp. His right hand found the edge of the tactical sphere's railing. 700 years. The vessel was older than the Dominion's assessment of Index 7714. It predated the threat rating. It had been built before the Dominion decided humans were irrelevant. "And it is armed," Voreth said. "It was not a question." The probe identified what appeared to be weapons arrays along the dorsal and ventral hull lines. It was unable to classify the armament type. The thermal interference was too severe. "Yes, Supreme Admiral." Voreth turned from the tactical sphere and walked 3 steps toward the viewport. From here, the Ninth Armada was a constellation of running lights stretching in every direction, the visible proof of 4,200 warships ready to answer his orders. He had pacified systems with 1/10 of this force. He had crushed the Cathani Confederation's border fleet with 600 ships and called it an excessive deployment. "Signal Fleet Commander Dranoth on the Severing Wind," he said, "and Fleet Commander Uriel on the Crimson Mandate. I want all 3 command staff on a secure channel within the quarter hour. Do not broadcast the probe's data to the general fleet network. Tactical officers only." "Yes, Supreme Admiral." The secure channel connected in 11 minutes. Dranoth was old, cautious, and had served under Voreth's predecessor. Uriel was young, decorated twice for aggression in the Rithani campaigns, and hungry in the way that officers who have never been surprised tend to be. Voreth shared the probe data without commentary and gave them 90 seconds to review. Dranoth spoke first. "The mass reading is an error." "The probe was calibrated before launch," Yenneith said across the channel. "I verified the calibration logs personally." "Then the contact is multiple vessels in close formation, and the probe is reading them as one. The silhouette shows a single hull, Fleet Commander." "Silence." Uriel broke it. "Even if the mass reading is accurate, it changes nothing. We have 4,200 warships. This is one contact. One. The mathematics are not complicated." "The mathematics," Voreth said, "assume we know what we are looking at. We do not." "We know it is one vessel," Uriel said. "We know it is stationary. We know it has not responded to the probe or attempted to evade. These are not the behaviors of a capable adversary. They are the behaviors of something that does not consider us a threat," Dranoth said quietly. Another silence. This one was heavier. Voreth let it sit for 5 seconds. Then he said, "I am ordering a reconnaissance in force. 3 screening groups, 200 ships each, will advance on the contact along 3 approach vectors. Standard triangulation doctrine. They will stop at effective weapons range and hold. They will not fire unless fired upon. I want a full sensor picture of that vessel from 3 angles before I commit the fleet." "And if it fires on the screening groups?" Uriel asked. "Then we will know what it fires," Voreth said. "And we will know what we are dealing with. Assemble the screening groups. Departure in 2 hours." The screening groups launched on schedule. 600 warships divided into 3 formations of 200, each approaching from a different vector, high, low, and lateral, converging on the contact's position in a standard triangulation pattern the Dominion had used for 300 years. Voreth watched their icons crawl across the tactical sphere. At standard approach speed, they would reach weapons range in approximately 7 hours. He used the time. He pulled everything the Dominion archives held on Index 7714. The file was thin, embarrassingly so for a species that had been cataloged for over a millennium. 17 pages. Most of it was atmospheric composition, gravity data, and a biological summary that described humans as mid-range oxygen breathers with unremarkable physical attributes. The military assessment was a single paragraph, pre-spacefaring at time of assessment, no fleet capability observed, quarantine maintained as standard protocol, reassessment interval, 500 years. The most recent reassessment was 400 years overdue. Voreth read the paragraph 3 times. Then he read the date on the original assessment, 914 years ago. He tried to calculate what a species with even modest industrial capacity could build in 900 years if no one was watching. The number he arrived at was not comforting. He did not share this calculation with anyone. He spent the next hour cross-referencing the Dominion's historical logs for any mention of contact with Quarantine Shell 7. There were 4 entries in 9 centuries. The first was the original assessment survey. The second, 300 years later, was a navigation buoy that recorded elevated electromagnetic emissions from within the shell before losing signal. The buoy failure had been attributed to solar activity. The third entry was a merchant convoy that reported unusual gravimetric readings near the shell boundary 400 years ago and rerouted without investigating. The fourth was a complaint filed by a Rithani border station 72 years ago about intermittent sensor ghosts, brief contacts that appeared at the edge of their detection range and vanished before they could be classified. Sensor ghosts. 72 years ago, the Dominion had sent a note to the Rithani telling them to recalibrate their equipment. Voreth closed the file and placed his primary hands flat on the railing. The ghosts had been real. Whatever was inside Quarantine Shell 7 had been watching the border for at least 72 years, probably longer, and the Dominion's response had been to tell the observers that their instruments were broken. The screening groups reached the outer boundary of effective weapons, range 6 hours and 47 minutes after launch. Group Keth, the high-angle approach, reported first. Supreme Admiral, we have visual confirmation of the contact. It is, the voice of Group Commander Selenth paused. Voreth could hear the sound of bridge officers talking rapidly in the background. It is significantly larger than the probe's imagery suggested. The hull extends beyond our forward sensor arc. We are adjusting. Clarify, Voreth said. Supreme Admiral, our forward sensor arc is calibrated for objects up to 12 kilometers in length. The contact exceeds that. We are reading, another pause, more background noise, 17.4 kilometers along its primary axis. Voreth's secondary hands gripped the railing behind his back. The unyielding throne, the largest ship in the Ninth Armada, was 3.8 kilometers long. Group Lara, confirm from your angle, he ordered. Group Commander Oventh's voice came through with a tension that had not been there at departure. Confirmed, Supreme Admiral, 17.4 kilometers. Width is approximately 4.1 kilometers. The mass reading is consistent with the probe's figure. 312 million metric tons. This is one vessel. Group Sen. Group Commander Falleth was the youngest of the 3. Her voice was tight but controlled. Confirmed from lateral. Supreme Admiral, I am reading extensive weapons arrays along the dorsal and ventral spines. My tactical officer counts over 600 individual emplacements visible from this angle alone. Many are of a type we cannot classify. There are also, she stopped. Continue, Group Commander. There are also what appear to be launch bays along the port and starboard flanks, large ones. Based on the bay dimensions, they could deploy strike craft larger than our torpedo frigates. I count 14 bays visible from my angle. There may be more on the far side. Voreth said nothing for several seconds. He was performing calculations. 600 weapons emplacements from one angle. The hull had 4 facets visible from 3 angles, which meant a total armament count somewhere in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 individual weapons. 14 launch bays on one side, likely 14 or more on the other, each capable of deploying craft larger than his torpedo frigates. And it was sitting still, no shields raised, no weapons charged, no broadcast. Waiting. Has the contact responded to your presence? He asked. Negative, Selenth said. No change in posture, no broadcast, no active scanning that we can detect. It knows they are there, Dranoth said from the severing wind. His voice carried something Voreth had never heard in it before. A vessel that size, with that sensor capability, it knew the probe was there. It knows the screening groups are there. It is choosing not to respond. Or it doesn't consider 200 ships worth responding to, Uriel said. Something in his tone had shifted since the briefing. The hunger was still there, but it had curdled into something more careful. Group Sen, additional report. Falleth's voice cut back across the channel. My engineering officer is analyzing the hull plating. The mismatched sections we observed in the probe imagery, they are not damage. They are upgrades. Different sections of the hull have been replaced or reinforced at different periods. The oldest plating matches the probe's estimate, 700 to 900 years. The newest plating, concentrated around the weapons arrays and the engine section, shows no oxidation at all. It was installed recently, within the last decade. Within the last decade, someone had been maintaining this vessel, upgrading it, improving its weapons. Adding armor, not the work of a derelict or a relic, the work of an active military infrastructure that was servicing its assets. Group Keth supplementary, Selenth again, his voice noticeably tighter than when he had first reported. I am now reading faint but consistent communications traffic between the contact and a point beyond our sensor range. The traffic is encrypted in a format we cannot decode. It is transmitting. Supreme Admiral, this vessel is in communication with something else, something we cannot see. The tactical sphere felt smaller. Voreth made a decision. Screening groups will hold position and maintain continuous sensor feed. All data to the tactical sphere in real time. I am advancing the main body of the fleet to join them. The entire fleet, Dranoth asked. The entire fleet, 4,200 warships. If that vessel sees the full strength of the Ninth Armada and chooses to remain passive, we will have our answer about its intentions. If it does not, we will have our answer about its capabilities. Either way, we stop guessing. The Ninth Armada moved as one. 4,200 warships broke formation and reformed into an advance column, standard approach doctrine for contested space. Voreth's unyielding throne sat at the center, flanked by Dranoth's severing wind and Uriel's crimson mandate. The dreadnoughts formed the core. The strike cruisers formed the envelope. The torpedo frigates and escorts spread in screening layers ahead and on the flanks. It took 4 hours to close the distance. When they arrived, Voreth understood why the screening group commanders had paused. The tactical sphere could render the contact now at full resolution from the combined sensor feeds of 600 ships plus the approach data of the main fleet. The human vessel filled the display. It was not a warship in any design language Voreth recognized. It was a fortress that someone had given engines. The hull was a brutal slab of overlapping armor plates, scarred and discolored and scorched, with weapons emplacements jutting from every surface like the spines of a deep ocean creature. The forward section was a wedge that tapered to a flat face bristling with what appeared to be projectile launchers, not energy weapons, not plasma arrays, but physical launchers designed to throw solid mass at tremendous velocity. The engine section at the stern was a cluster of 12 primary drive cones, each one larger than a Dominion strike cruiser. And it glowed, not with running lights or navigational markers, it glowed with internal heat. Across the entire 17.4-kilometer hull, thousands of points of warm orange light shone through viewports, exhaust vents, cooling grills, and gaps in the armor. The ship was alive, every system running, every compartment lit, every weapon mount warmed. It had not moved, it had not spoken. It had not raised shields or charged weapons. It simply existed, a thing that no archive in the Dominion said was possible. "Supreme Admiral," Yenneith said. Her throat slits had stopped cycling entirely. "I have completed a full spectral analysis of the hull. The armor composition does not match any known material in our database. The closest analog is a tungsten carbide composite, but the molecular structure includes elements we cannot identify. The armor thickness on the forward section alone is estimated at 140 meters. 140 meters of armor. The unyielding throne had armor 11 meters thick, and it was the most heavily armored vessel in the Dominion fleet. I am now reading the weapons arrays in detail," Yenneith continued. "The projectile launchers on the forward face appear to be electromagnetic accelerators, what the Index 7714 archive refers to as railguns, though I had to search for the term because it is listed under the Human Cultural Appendix, not the military section. They were not considered a military technology at the time of assessment." She paused. "The accelerator rails are 47 meters long. If the propulsion mechanism matches even basic electromagnetic principles, the muzzle velocity would be—" She stopped working her console. "Supreme Admiral, the muzzle velocity would exceed anything in our defensive modeling. Our point defense systems are calibrated for energy weapons and guided torpedoes. A solid projectile at that velocity, we have no intercept protocol." The tactical sphere was silent. 23 officers stood at their stations around its perimeter, and not one of them spoke. Voreth broke the silence. "Open a broad-spectrum channel to the contact. All frequencies. Translate into the Index 7714 language. The archive should have baseline linguistic data." "It does, broadcasting now." They waited, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5. The contact did not respond. "Repeat the broadcast," Voreth ordered. 10 minutes of silence. "It is not interested in talking," Dranoth said. "Or it has nothing to say to us," Voreth replied. He turned to Yenneith. "Is the vessel alone? Extend the sensor sweep to maximum range. I want to know if there are other contacts within 2 light towers." The sweep took 11 minutes. The result landed like a stone in Voreth's stomach. "No other contacts, Supreme Admiral. The vessel is alone." One vessel, alone, in a quarantine shell that the Dominion had ignored for 9 centuries, and it was not running, not hiding, not calling for help. It was sitting in the dark like a predator at a watering hole. Voreth felt something he had not felt in 42 years of command. He did not have a word for it in Velori, because the Velori language had not needed to name it. The closest translation was the sensation a deep-water creature feels when it realizes the shadow above it is not a cloud. He mastered it. He was Supreme Admiral Voreth Keln. He had 4,200 warships. He had 3 dreadnoughts. He had the mathematics. "Deploy to engagement formation," he said. "Full crescent. The dreadnoughts hold the center, strike cruisers on the wings, torpedo frigates in the 3rd rank, escorts forward. I want the contact enveloped on 3 sides, above, below, and lateral. Leave the stern approach open." "Sir," Uriel's voice on the command channel, "you're leaving the stern approach open. If it chooses to retreat, I want to see how it moves. Acceleration profile, turn radius, engine output. That data is worth more than a kill. And if it does not retreat, then it will be enveloped by 4,200 warships with weapons trained on it from 3 sides. That is the definition of a pincer fleet commander. The open lane is bait. If it takes the bait, we learn. If it doesn't, we close the lane and we have encirclement. The Ninth Armada flowed into full crescent formation. It was a beautiful thing. Voreth knew thousands of ships moving in coordinated arcs, settling into layered firing positions with practiced precision. The upper jaw of the crescent rose above the contact. The lower jaw sank beneath it. The lateral wings spread to either side. The open stern lane stretched behind the human vessel like an invitation. The human vessel did nothing. It sat at the center of the closing crescent like a stone in a river. No change in posture, no change in emissions, no broadcast. Formation complete, Yeneth reported. All ships in firing position, weapons hot across the fleet. Time to bring the crescent to full encirclement. If I order the stern lane closed. 4 minutes at combat speed. Voreth studied the tactical sphere. The human vessel sat at its center, a single dark icon surrounded by 4,200 Dominion warship markers. The formation was textbook. The firing arcs were overlapping. Every torpedo frigate had a solution. Every strike cruiser had a broadside angle. 4,200 against 1. He should feel confident. The mathematics demanded it. But the mathematics had been built on the assumption that the Dominion's archives were accurate, and the archives said humans were pre-spacefaring, and the thing sitting at the center of his formation was 17.4 kilometers long. Supreme Admiral, Yeneth's voice had changed. The careful control was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. I am reading a change in the contact's emissions. Specify. The thermal output has increased by 14% across the entire hull. The engine cluster, the 12 primary drives, they are cycling. Not firing, cycling, like an idle warming to readiness. Weapon status. Yeneth's hands moved across her console. Supreme Admiral, the weapons emplacements are moving. The turret assemblies on the dorsal and ventral spines are tracking. They are moving independently, different turrets tracking different targets. How many turrets? I am counting 1,240 turrets in active track mode. They are designating individual ships in our formation. Each turret has acquired a separate target. 1,240 turrets, each one locked onto a different Dominion warship. The vessel had not fired, had not spoken, had not moved, but it had just demonstrated that it could see every ship in the Ninth Armada and could target 1,200 of them simultaneously. Railgun emplacements on the forward face are charging, Yeneth said. I can see the electromagnetic buildup on the spectral analysis. They will be at full charge in. How long? They are already at full charge. The buildup I am reading is them cycling past full charge into an overcharged state. Supreme Admiral, I do not know what an overcharged railgun does. Voreth's mouth went dry. He realized with clinical clarity that the human vessel had been at full charge before the Ninth Armada had arrived, before the screening groups, before the probe. It had been sitting in the dark with every weapon loaded and every turret calibrated, and it had waited. It had let him bring his entire fleet into range. It had let him arrange his ships into a formation. It had let him build his own cage. Supreme Admiral, Dranoth's voice, low, strained on the private command channel. We should withdraw. Withdraw, Voreth tasted the word. This is not a contact. This is not an engagement target. This is something else. We do not have a doctrine for something else. I am asking you, as someone who has served with you for 31 years, pull the fleet back. We can report to High Command and request a diplomatic approach. This does not have to end in weapons fire. It may not be our choice, Dranoth. It is our choice until we fire first. After that it becomes its choice, and I do not want that. Voreth said nothing for 4 seconds. On the tactical sphere, 1,240 tracking indicators held steady on 1,240 Dominion warships. The turrets did not waver. They did not cycle between targets or lose lock. They held. patient as stone. Then Uriel spoke, and his voice was tight with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear. Supreme Admiral, we cannot sit here. Every second we hold position in this formation, that thing is reading our sensor profiles, our weapon signatures, our engine outputs. It is cataloging us the way we catalog insurgent skirmishers. If we withdraw now, it will know everything about the Ninth Armada's capabilities, and we will know nothing about its limits. We have to test it. Test it, Dranoth repeated. You want to test a vessel with 1,200 turrets locked on our ships. I want to know if it bleeds. If it does, we win, we have 4,000 ships. If it does not, we break contact and we know. Either way, the Dominion needs the data. Voreth listened to them both and heard the two poles of his own mind arguing. The cautious voice said pull back. The strategic voice said the data was worth the cost, because the Dominion had to know what was inside Quarantine Shell 7, and this was the only fleet large enough to survive the testing. But a third voice, one he had never heard before in 4 decades of command, said something simpler. It said, "You are already inside its range. You have been inside its range since the probe. Withdrawal is not a retreat from danger. It is a request for permission to leave, and you do not know if it will grant that permission." All ships, Voreth said, and his voice did not waver because he would not allow it to waver. Weapons free. Priority target. The human vessel moved. It did not accelerate gradually. It did not build speed. One frame of the tactical sphere showed it stationary. The next frame showed it at velocity. The acceleration was so violent that the inertial calculations on the tactical sphere threw an error. The system was not designed to process an object of that mass moving that quickly from a dead stop. It drove straight into the upper jaw of the crescent. The first volley came from the dorsal turrets, the 1,240 independently tracking weapons that had been designating Dominion ships for the past several minutes. They fired in a staggered ripple that lasted less than 2 seconds. 1,240 projectiles crossed the gap between the human vessel and the upper formation of the crescent, in the time it took Voreth to draw one breath. The impacts were not explosions, they were erasures. Where a Dominion strike cruiser had been 1.2 kilometers of armored warship with a crew of 800, there was a flash and then there was debris. The projectiles punched through shields, through armor, through internal structure, and out the other side. Ships did not burn. They did not list or vent atmosphere in dramatic plumes. They came apart, structurally. Like objects struck by forces so far beyond their engineering tolerances that the concept of damage did not apply. Voreth watched 847 Dominion warships die in 11 seconds. The upper jaw of the crescent ceased to exist. "Return fire," Uriel was screaming across the command channel. The Crimson Mandate's batteries opened up, and across the formation, 2,000 warships fired simultaneously, plasma lances, torpedo spreads, directed energy arrays, everything the Ninth Armada had. The barrage struck the human vessel's hull. Voreth watched the impact telemetry with absolute focus. He needed to see damage. He needed to see something, a hull breach, a scored plate, a disabled turret. The plasma lances splashed across the armor and dissipated. The torpedoes struck the hull and detonated. The directed energy beams played across the surface and left scorch, marks that the hull's thermal output erased in seconds. 140 meters of unknown alloy. The Dominion's weapons were scratching it. The human vessel reached the space where the upper jaw had been, and it turned. Not a banking turn, a pivot. The entire 17.4-kilometer mass rotated on its central axis like a blade turning edge-on. The ventral turrets, which had been facing the empty void above the formation, now faced the lower jaw of the crescent. They fired. The lower jaw died faster than the upper. The ships there had watched the upper formation dissolve, and many of them were already trying to break formation, engines at emergency thrust, courses scattering. It made no difference. The turrets tracked independently. Each one followed its designated target. Each projectile found its ship. 611 warships in the lower jaw were struck in 9 seconds. Most were destroyed outright. Some, the ones at the extreme edges of the formation that were already accelerating away, survived the first impact and tumbled, venting atmosphere and bodies, before the turrets cycled and fired again. Vorath's formation had been 4,200 ships. In 20 seconds of engagement, it was 2,742. "Close the stern lane," Vorath ordered. His voice was ice. "All remaining ships converge, full encirclement. Concentrate fire on the engine section. If it has drives, it has fuel, and fuel burns." The surviving fleet obeyed. The lateral wings of the crescent swept inward, and the stern lane, the escape route Vorath had left open as bait, began to close. 2,700 warships converging on a single target from all remaining angles. The human vessel turned toward the closing stern lane. For one instant, Vorath thought it was retreating. He felt a flicker of not relief but comprehension. The lane was closing, the vessel saw the trap and was breaking for open space. That was rational. That was something he understood. A fighting withdrawal, tactical disengagement. The behaviors of a capable adversary that recognized superior numbers. Then the launch bays opened. 14 bays on the port side, 14 on the starboard. 28 openings along the vessel's flanks, each one 40 meters across, and from each one poured a stream of smaller craft. Not fighters, the word was inadequate. They were angular, armored, autonomous, and they moved with a coordinated precision that suggested either drone control or pilots with reaction times Vorath's species could not match. They were each approximately 70 meters long, the size of a Dominion escort vessel, and they carried their own weapons arrays. 336 of them, launched in less than a minute. They hit the lateral wings of the closing crescent from both sides simultaneously. The engagement became a swarm. The smaller craft moved through the Dominion formation at velocities that made them nearly impossible to track with point defense systems designed for torpedoes and missiles. They fired as they flew, short, savage bursts from weapons that punched through escort-class hulls like puncturing membrane. The lateral wings of the crescent came apart in a chaos of close-quarters destruction that the tactical sphere could barely render. And the human vessel itself, the parent ship, the 17.4-kilometer fortress, drove through the closing stern lane before it could shut. Not retreating, repositioning. It swung around behind the remaining Dominion formation and fired its forward railguns into the rear of the fleet. Vorath's pincer had been reversed. The formation he had built to envelop the human vessel was now itself enveloped. The parent ship behind them, the swarm craft on their flanks, and nothing ahead but empty space. "Severing wind status," Vorath called. "Silence." Dranoth respond. Yenneith checked the fleet register. Her voice was nearly inaudible. The severing wind took a direct hit from the forward railguns during the repositioning maneuver. I am not reading its transponder. 3.2 kilometers of dreadnought, gone. Crimson Mandate. Still active. Heavy damage to the port battery sections. Fleet Commander Uriel reports 40% weapons capability. Tell Uriel to concentrate all remaining fire on the engine section. Every ship that can still shoot, engine section. Now, what remained of the Ninth Armada turned its guns on the human vessel's stern. 800 strike cruisers, 400 torpedo frigates, and assorted escorts, perhaps 1,500 ships still combat capable, fired everything they had at the 12 primary drive cones. The salvo was massive. Plasma, torpedoes, directed energy, kinetic rounds from the few Dominion ships that carried ballistic weapons. A converging wall of fire aimed at the one section of the vessel that had to be vulnerable, because physics demanded that engines need fuel and fuel needs containment. The human vessel did not evade. It absorbed the salvo. When the fire cleared, Voreth stared at the sensor data and understood. 2 of the 12 drive cones had sustained visible damage, scoring on their outer cowlings, a flickering in their thermal output. 2 out of 12. The other 10 were unaffected. The vessel's acceleration had not changed. Its weapons had not stopped firing. Its swarm craft had not recalled. 1,500 Dominion warships had fired everything they had, and they had scratched 2 engines. The human vessel's turrets cycled again. What followed was not a battle. Voreth had commanded 6 fleet engagements in his career, and he understood the taxonomy of combat, the give and take, the maneuver and countermaneuver, the calculated exchange of losses for position. This was none of those things. This was a harvest. The turrets worked through the remaining formation with a methodical patience that Voreth found more terrifying than rage. Each turret tracked. Each turret fired. Each projectile hit. The strike cruisers died in clusters of 10 and 20 as the turrets swept across the formation in systematic arcs. The torpedo frigates, smaller and faster, lasted slightly longer. Some of them managed to close to point-blank range and fire into the hull at 0 deflection. Their torpedoes struck the armor. The armor held. The turrets tracked them and ended them. The swarm craft worked the edges. Any ship that broke from the formation and ran, and many did now, their captains making the individual calculation that flight was preferable to annihilation, found the smaller craft on their flanks. The drones were faster, more maneuverable and relentless. They pursued, they caught, they killed. Voreth watched his fleet die on the tactical sphere. The icons winked out in clusters and streams and individual blinks, and each blink was a ship, and each ship was a crew, and each crew was hundreds of Valori officers and specialists who had served the Dominion with competence and loyalty, and who were now debris. The Crimson Mandate lasted longer than most. Uriel threw everything the dreadnought had left into the fight, point-blank broadsides from the starboard batteries, torpedo salvos from the ventral launchers, even ramming the helm toward the human vessel's stern in what might have been a desperate attempt to force a collision. The human vessel did not move to avoid it. One of the swarm craft intercepted the Crimson Mandate's approach, driving a sustained burst into its portside drive section. The dreadnought slewed sideways, its approach angle gone, its port hull peeling open. A turret from the parent ship tracked the drifting dreadnought and fired a single round through the reactor compartment. The Crimson Mandate broke in half. The 2 sections tumbled away from each other in silence, trailing debris and frozen atmosphere. Uriel's transponder went dark. The engagement lasted 14 minutes from the first turret volley. At the end of those 14 minutes, the tactical sphere showed 41 Dominion warship transponders still active. 41 out of 4,200. Most of them were damaged. Many were drifting. Some were still firing, which Voreth respected. There was something admirable about a torpedo frigate with half its hull open to vacuum still cycling its launchers at a target that could not be hurt. The human vessel ceased firing. It did not chase the 41 survivors. It did not broadcast a demand for surrender. It did not announce itself, explain itself, or gloat. It simply stopped shooting, recalled its swarm craft into the launch bays, and resumed the posture it had held before the Ninth Armada arrived. Stationary, silent, glowing with internal heat. As if nothing had happened. Voreth stood at the center of a tactical sphere that was mostly empty. The unyielding throne had survived. It was a dreadnought, heavier than most of the ships that had died, and it had been at the center of the formation rather than the edges where the killing was worst. It had taken hits. The port armor was breached in 3 places. 2 of its engine pods were offline, but it was alive, and so was he, and so were the 3,000 crew aboard who had watched the destruction of the Ninth Armada from its bridge. "Yeneth," he said. His voice was the same quiet tone it had always been. "Record the following to the Dominion High Command, priority absolute, all encryption channels." Recording Supreme Admiral. This is Supreme Admiral Voreth Keln, commanding the Ninth Armada. At 1600-hour standard, the Ninth Armada engaged a single unidentified vessel in Quarantine Shell 7. The vessel's specifications exceed anything in the Dominion's engagement library. The vessel is 17.4 kilometers long, massing 312 million metric tons. It carries over 2,000 independently targeting turret weapons, electromagnetic accelerators with muzzle velocities beyond our defensive parameters, and approximately 300 combat drones launched from 28 internal bays. Its armor exceeds 140 meters of an unidentified alloy that resisted concentrated fire from 1,500 warships. He paused. The tactical sphere hummed with the transponders of 41 ships. The Ninth Armada engaged with 4,200 warships. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. 41 ships survived. The Severing Wind is destroyed with all hands. The Crimson Mandate is destroyed with all hands. Casualties are estimated at... He stopped. He looked at Yenneith. She gave him the number. 987,000 personnel. Nearly 1 million in 14 minutes. The vessel sustained no observable structural damage. 2 of 12 engine cowlings show surface scoring. No hull breaches detected. No weapons were disabled. No change in operational capability. He let that settle into the recording. The vessel has ceased fire and resumed a passive posture. It is not pursuing the survivors. It is not broadcasting. It did not broadcast at any point during the engagement. It did not respond to our hails before the engagement. It did not issue warnings, demands, or identification. It fought in silence and has returned to silence. Voreth turned to the viewport. The human vessel was visible now not as a tactical icon but as a physical shape against the stars. At this range, with the unyielding throne's external cameras, he could see it clearly. The scarred hull, the glowing viewports, the turrets now still pointed at nothing. Recommendation to High Command, he continued. Update the threat assessment for Index 7714 immediately. Current rating of 0.4 is he searched for the word. In 42 years of service, he had never needed it. Incorrect. The species classified as human is not pre-spacefaring. It is not non-emergent fauna. The vessel we engaged today was built by a civilization with military capabilities that exceed the Dominion's by a factor I am not qualified to estimate. He took a breath. I further recommend that the Dominion not attempt a second engagement. The Ninth Armada was the largest single fleet we have deployed in 3 generations. It was destroyed by one vessel in 14 minutes. The vessel is undamaged. I do not know how many more of them exist. I do not know why this one was here. I do not know why it let us approach, let us surround it, and let us fire first. His secondary hands were trembling. He placed them flat against the railing. I suspect it was studying us. The recording ran for another 3 seconds of silence before Yenneith stopped it. Voreth stood at the viewport for a long time. The bridge crew worked around him in near silence. Damage reports, casualty figures, systems assessments, the mechanical process of a warship cataloging its own wounds. The 41 surviving ships of the Ninth Armada drifted in a loose cluster, some under power, some not. Medical shuttles moved between them. Hours passed. Voreth did not leave the bridge. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He stood at the viewport and watched the human vessel sit in the dark, glowing quietly, and he thought about the thing that disturbed him more than the firepower, more than the armor, more than the speed. It had let them fire first. A vessel with that capability, one that could destroy 4,000 warships in 14 minutes, had sat passively while the Ninth Armada surrounded it. It had allowed itself to be enveloped. It had not fired until Voreth gave the order to fire. And then it had dismantled the most powerful fleet in Dominion history with the mechanical efficiency of a surgeon removing a growth. It had not been angry. It had not been threatened. It had not been defending itself in any way that implied it had been in danger. It had responded to an attack the way a parent responds to a child throwing stones, with just enough force to stop the behavior and no more. It had killed 4,159 warships to make a point, and when the point was made, it had stopped. And it had done all of this without saying a word. Voreth replayed the engagement on his personal console. He watched the turret fire patterns. They were not random, not chaotic, not the spray-and-kill pattern of a weapon system in defensive mode. They were sequential, systematic. The turrets had worked through the formation in an organized sweep, starting with the ships that posed the greatest threat, the strike cruisers with the heaviest batteries, and ending with the escorts. Each target was hit once, precisely once. The projectile was calibrated to the target, heavier rounds for cruisers, lighter for escorts. Nothing was overkill, nothing was wasted. This was not a weapon system in combat. This was a weapon system in demonstration. He cycled through the swarm craft engagement footage. The drones had behaved with the same calibrated discipline as the turrets. None had pursued a target beyond the boundary of the original engagement zone. None had attacked escape pods or debris. When a ship was disabled, engines gone, weapons silent, hull venting, the drones passed it by and moved to the next active target. They were not predators. They were not even weapons in the way Voreth understood weapons. They were a message delivery system, and the message was, we can reach everything in your formation, and we choose which things to end. The 41 survivors were the proof, not random survivors, not lucky ones who happened to be at the edge of the formation. They were the ships the human vessel had decided to leave alive. The ones that were too damaged to fight, too small to matter, or, in the unyielding throne's case, too central to the command structure to destroy if you wanted someone left alive to carry the report home. It had left him alive on purpose. Voreth pulled the crew manifest for the 41 surviving ships. The unyielding throne, 3,000 crew, heavy damage but structurally intact. 14 torpedo frigates in various states of operational capacity, crews ranging from 30 to 200. 11 escort corvettes, most with hull breaches sealed by emergency bulkheads. 9 interceptors that had been at the extreme trailing edge of the formation and had never entered the engagement zone. 6 logistics vessels that had been behind the formation entirely. Fuel tenders, a hospital ship, and 2 ammunition carriers that were now carrying ammunition for weapons that no longer existed on ships that no longer existed. He pulled the casualty reports as they came in from the surviving ships. The numbers built like water rising. 800 from the strike cruiser wing that had held the upper jaw, 600 from the lower jaw, 2,000 from the torpedo frigate squadrons, 1,200 from the escort screen, 4,400 from the dreadnought severing wind alone, Dranoth and every officer and specialist who had served under him, including his flag staff of 62, his engineering complement of 400, and his damage control teams who had never had the chance to control any damage because the ship had ceased to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The Crimson Mandate's casualty figure was still being compiled. Uriel's crew complement had been 3,800. Early reports from the escape pods, there were escape pods, a handful, launched in the 2 seconds between the hull breach and the reactor detonation, suggested fewer than 90 survivors. Uriel was not among them. Voreth had served with Uriel for 6 years. The younger officer had been brilliant, aggressive, and wrong about the mathematics. He had wanted to test whether the vessel could bleed. The answer had cost him his ship, his crew, and his life, and the vessel had not bled at all. Voreth had served with Dranoth for 31 years. Dranoth had been right. He had said withdraw. He had called this something else, something they had no doctrine for. He had asked Voreth to pull the fleet back, and Voreth had weighed that advice against the strategic need for data, and he had chosen data, and now Dranoth was particulate matter dispersing in a vacuum. The data had been acquired. The cost was 987,000 lives. Voreth catalogued his own culpability with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else. He had brought the fleet forward. He had deployed the Crescent. He had given the weapons-free order. Every decision had been tactically sound within the framework of the Dominion's doctrine, and the framework itself had been built on an assumption that was 900 years out of date. The failure was not his tactics. The failure was the assumption underneath them. The assumption that the Dominion's archives were accurate, that a threat rating of 0.4 meant something, that a quarantine shell was a barrier rather than a courtesy extended by a neighbor who had outgrown the need for barriers centuries ago. The vessel had been polite. That was the word that kept surfacing in Voreth's thoughts, and he could not make it stop. The vessel had been polite. It had waited for him to fire first. It had used precisely enough force to stop the engagement without pursuing the survivors. It had not gloated, demanded, or threatened. It had simply demonstrated what it was, allowed him to survive the demonstration, and then return to its work. Cartographic operations. It had been making maps. The most powerful weapons platform Voreth had ever encountered, carrying enough firepower to sterilize a solar system, had been in Quarantine Shell 7 to make maps. Supreme Admiral. Voreth turned. Yenneith stood at her console, her throat slits cycling with a rhythm he had learned to associate with deeply suppressed alarm. What is it? Long-range sensors have detected additional contacts at the edge of Quarantine Shell 7. Multiple contacts. How many? Yenneith's hands moved across her console. Her throat slit stopped. I am reading 47 contacts, Supreme Admiral. Same mass profile, same thermal signature, same silhouette. 47. 47 vessels, identical to the one that had just destroyed the Ninth Armada. They were holding position at the edge of the Quarantine Shell, not approaching, not retreating, just sitting there in a formation that, when Voreth mapped it on the tactical sphere, formed a loose hemisphere around the Dominion's border, a hemisphere that stretched across 3 sectors and covered every approach vector into the Cinder approach. The lone vessel had not been alone. It had been the forward element. The scouts had been scouted. The reconnaissance in force had been the subject of its own reconnaissance. And the 47 vessels at the edge of the Quarantine Shell were not an attack fleet. They were a fence. Voreth stared at the display. 47. Each one 17.4 kilometers long, each one carrying over 2,000 turrets, 300 drones, and 140 meters of impenetrable armor. The combined mass was 14.6 billion metric tons. The combined turret count exceeded 94,000. Against this, the entire Dominion Navy, every fleet, every armada, every reserve, could field perhaps 30,000 warships. Less than a quarter of the firepower needed to destroy a single one. The 47 vessels were not there to fight the Dominion. They were there to make sure the Dominion understood that fighting was no longer a concept that applied. Supreme Admiral, Yenneith said, we are receiving a broadcast. Voreth's breath stopped. From the contact. From the group at the edge of the shell. It is a short-range transmission, wide spectrum, in our language. Play it. A voice filled the tactical sphere. It was flat, calm, and spoke Velori with a precision that suggested it had been learned from the Dominion's own communications intercepts. This is the Terran Boundary Commission vessel Anvil Tide. You have engaged and been defeated by the survey ship Quiet Vigil, which was conducting routine cartographic operations in this sector. The Quiet Vigil was not a warship. It was an unarmed survey vessel carrying standard self-defense systems. The voice paused. The silence on the bridge was absolute. Standard self-defense systems. We wish to be clear about this, because there appears to be a significant gap in your records regarding our species. What you encountered today was the minimum armament we install on vessels that are not expected to see combat. Our warships carry considerably more. Another pause. We are not hostile. We are not expansionist. We do not seek conflict with the Velori Dominion or any member species of your administration. The boundary you see at the edge of this shell is a navigation advisory, not a threat. You are welcome to send diplomatic envoys through designated channels, which we will establish shortly. The voice stopped, then in a tone that Voreth could only describe as careful. We recommend you update your records. The transmission ended. Voreth stood in the silence of a tactical sphere that held the transponders of 41 ships, all that remained of the 4,200 he had led into quarantine shell 7. He stood in the silence and understood the scope of the Dominion's error. Not a military error, not a tactical failure, a categorical one. An error so fundamental that it could not be corrected by building more ships or training better officers or developing new weapons. The Dominion had classified a species. It had measured them, assessed them, stamped them with a number, and filed them away. And in the 900 years since that filing, that species had built a civilization that could produce survey ships with more firepower than the Dominion's greatest armada, and they called those survey ships unarmed. He thought about the word unarmed and what it meant when a species' definition of unarmed included 1,200 independently targeting turrets and 300 combat drones and 140 meters of impenetrable armor. He thought about what their definition of armed might look like, and his mind provided no image because there was no frame of reference. There was no scale. The category had no ceiling. He thought about the 47 identical vessels sitting at the edge of the quarantine shell, and he understood that they were the fence, not the farmer. Somewhere beyond that fence, in the space the Dominion had dismissed as belonging to non-emergent fauna, there were more. There would always be more. A species that could build 48 of these things in 900 years could build 480. 4,800. They had been building, while the Dominion filed paperwork and reassessed at 500-year intervals, and let the reassessments lapse. The dread had been mounting in him since the probe's first impossible reading, and now it crested and broke and settled into something colder and more permanent. Not panic, not despair. Understanding. The particular, quiet understanding of a career admiral who had just learned that his entire professional life, every engagement, every fleet maneuver, every campaign medal had been conducted in a sandbox. A controlled environment where the Dominion played at being the apex power, and the real apex power watched from the other side of a quarantine shell and said nothing. Yeneth, he said. Supreme Admiral. Set course for Dominion Central, best available speed. Yes, Supreme Admiral. And send a reply to the Terran Boundary Commission. Keep it short. What should it say, Supreme Admiral? Voreth looked at the human vessel one last time. The quiet vigil, the survey ship, the unarmed cartographic platform that had erased 98% of his fleet in 14 minutes, and then politely waited for him to process what had happened. It should say, message received. Records will be updated. The unyielding throne turned away from quarantine shell 7. 40 ships followed. The 41st, a torpedo frigate with no engines and a crew of 37, was taken under tow. Behind them, the quiet vigil returned to its cartographic survey. Its turrets powered down. Its launch bays closed. Its hull continued to glow with the quiet, patient heat of a vessel that had never been in danger and knew it. In the Dominion's navigational archives, Index 7714 still carried a threat rating of 0.4. The update would take time. Bureaucracies move slowly, and the Dominion's bureaucracy moved slower than most. Forms would be filed. Committees would convene. Assessments would be debated. Somewhere in the halls of Dominion Central, an archivist would pull the file on Index 7714, and find 17 pages of atmospheric readings and biological summaries, and a single paragraph that said, "No fleet capability observed." That archivist would read Vorath's report, and then they would read the 17 pages again, and then they would sit very still at their desk and understand what Vorath already understood, that the Dominion systems had not failed. The Dominion systems had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had assessed, classified, filed, and moved on. The systems worked. The systems had always worked. What had not worked was the belief that assessment was the same as understanding, that knowing what something measured meant knowing what it was. The humans had never objected to being measured. They had never objected to the quarantine shell. They had never reached out, never complained, never demanded recognition. They had simply gone about the work of building, for 900 years, a civilization so far beyond the Dominion's comprehension that the Dominion's most powerful fleet was a minor inconvenience to one of their mapping ships. But Vorath knew the number, and the number was all that mattered. 4,200 ships against 1. 14 minutes. 41 survivors. And the thing that had killed them was not even a warship.